Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. I've got a great new feature in Photoshop to talk about today. It's called lens blur. Now, I'm going to approach this from the wildlife perspective, but if you're curious about lens blur and how it works, in this video, I'm going to tell you the good, the bad, and maybe even the ugly about this feature. So you're going to want to stay tuned, and we'll get to it right after this. A few months ago, Photoshop introduced a few new features in its software, and there were three that really stood out to me. The one that got the most attention was called generative fill. It's a very, very versatile way to take away elements, even add elements into a photo, and it all used AI technology. So while that was the greatest introduction or change to the software, there were two others that stood out to me. One involved colors and just more detail around color. And then the change we're going to talk about today called lens blur. Now, this is an additional feature to both Photoshop and Lightroom. And in my workflow, you're going to see this in the Photoshop Camera Raw application. But if you're a Lightroom user, don't worry about it. Everything that I show you today is going to apply to Lightroom. Now, to start this video, I'm going to put up a few images to illustrate what lens blur is all about. On this side, I'm going to put up an image shot at f8. Now, these are all shot with a 560 millimeter equivalent lens, and this image was shot at f8, around 10 feet away. That background is about 6 inches away. And this lens blur technique is mostly going to deal with the ability to blur out a background more than the aperture that you shot it at. As most of you know, as you open up an aperture and make it bigger, it does a couple things. It lets in more light, so it helps with your noise. It will bring down your equivalent ISO, shot at the same shutter speed. It also, when you open up the aperture, softens the background, and that's called bokeh, so you may hear that term a lot through this video. Bokeh and depth of field are both related, but again, as an aperture gets bigger, the backgrounds tend to get softer, and the depth of field gets shallower, meaning not as much as in focus. So the image you're looking at is at f8. I'm going to put two more images out. Now, the caveat with these is your turn to pick out which one is which. One of these images is shot at f4. And like I just explained with f4, I've opened the aperture. The lower the f-stop, the larger the aperture. I've opened the aperture up, and that's going to create a softer background. In the other image, I simply took the f8 image and applied it to Photoshop and Lightroom's new feature called lens blur. And that attempted to take the background and soften it up. Now, of the two over there, which one looks better to your eye? Let me put them side by side for you. Let me make them a little bigger. Which one looks better, and do either of these look unnatural to you? Can you tell the difference between what I shot at f4 and what I shot at f8 and then applied this lens blur technique to? Now, the image on the left is the image that was shot at f4. The image on the right is the image shot at f8 with the lens blur technique. Now let's dig into that technique a little bit. I've got the same image here, and I'm going to show you a few things on this screen. We're going to be using this screen for a lot of the video. I've got 5 images, and the way this video is going to work is I'm going to get right into lens blur. I'm going to show you how it works. I'm going to start with the simplest applications, and then we'll make it a little bit tougher. Each image will reflect a different feature of lens blur and really highlight some of the positives, but also, and maybe more importantly, show you some of the pitfalls of this. And I've got different images that will illustrate this. I promise you, if you're interested in this video is going to show it to you. As with all my videos, I am practical. I love to show you the real life situations, and it's not always good. Show you the good, the bad, and the ugly on this channel. So let's get into this one. What you're looking at right now is shot at f4. So this is my lens opened up to its widest capacity, my largest aperture. Here, you'll see that contrast. There's f8. You can see it pretty, I'll toggle it back and forth. f4, f8, you see that difference. Now let's look at the blurred technique. So this is f8 with the lens blur, and you could see nice and blurred out. Now what I'm going to do is actually zoom in here a little bit, and we're going to go back to f4. And I'm going to zoom in. I want to point out a couple things here. You're going to see a couple differences. I'm going to go all the way to the corner. I want you to see the eye in the background. F4, I've got an even noise pattern, no noise reduction, no editing done to this. F8, couple things you'll notice. You'll notice that brown section got a little more in focus. And one of the advantages of blurring backgrounds is it tends to soften up some of these imperfections if there's little spots back there. I also want you to notice over here on the feathers. Watch what happens. F4, you're going to see that fine little feather hanging out, and I'll highlight it there. Now watch what happens at F8. it actually gets better. It gets more detailed. It's because I've put the subject in focus. I've put all of the subject in focus. It's a little bit of a positive for most wildlife photographers. But as I put the subject more in focus, I expand the depth of field. So I also bring in some more detail from the background. So it's not as blurred out. One of the advantages of this technique is that potentially you can shoot the subject at f8 and simulate the background at f4. Look at this. Couple things happened though. I kept the focal plane. I kept this eye in focus. So the whole eye's now in focus because I've shot it at f8. The background got nice and soft and blurred out, but I want you to watch the feather detail. Notice the edges of the feather. We're going to talk about more of this in the pitfall section. You'll see when I zoom it out, you may not tell the difference as much. Notice this is the zoomed out, looks really good. But when you start to dig into the details, you'll see a little of these downfalls. Now we're going to dig into lens blur right now. Now to illustrate this, I'm going to pull up a very simple image of a goldfinch. And I chose this image specifically for a few reasons. We're going to get into lens blur. I'm going to show you how it works. And I'm just going to show you the very basic function of this. And this function works really, really well when the subject is well defined. And you could see this goldfinch, while it has some feathers on it, they're not sticking out. There's not a lot of complex edges. It's just a nice shape. The stick has a nice shape, and it's going to work really, really well using this lens blur. And what I'm going to do to apply this is go into the filter menu and hit camera raw. As I click on the lens blur, and you can see it down here at the bottom, I've opened it up. I'm going to hit the apply button. You'll see a little wheel start to calculate. What it's calculating is subject and background. It's detecting edges of where the subject should be. Now this subject is really easy because it's almost two different dimensions or two different focal planes. The bird is in focus, that's one focal plane. The background is back here and it's at a distance, and that's all there is. So there's not a lot of complexity. There's not a lot of depth in this image. There's focus with the subject and there's background. What it just did is it calculated where the background is, and it calculated where it thinks I should blur it out. Let me go down to this slider. You'll see it down here. Let me make it a little bigger for you. There's a couple other boxes down here. We'll get into those in a minute, but we're just going to deal with this slider. In an easy image, in an image with just a couple focal planes, all we have to do is select the amount of blur. I'm going to go from 0. I'm going to click it to 100, and you'll see the difference right away. See the difference? Let me go to 100%. That's 100. There's the original. And you could see how well it worked. If we look around these really easy edges, and by easy I just mean it's just a kind of a straight line. There's not a lot of complexity, not a lot of feathers, not a lot of fur. Watch how well it does in selecting the background from the subject. See that? Really, really powerful. Now I've got some other examples of this where it's not going to be as easy and it's not going to be as simple, and the results aren't going to be quite as good. But in this first example, we're just going to deal with that first top slider. Now I will tell you, right underneath that slider is a section called bokeh, and this is to simulate different lenses. I've played around with this and I haven't found anything that really stands out. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this video on it. I will tell you, if I click this last one called cat eye, you can see it kind of distorts a little bit, but the other ones didn't make that much of a difference. I think you'll get a better selection on these if you have small dots of light where the shapes will change slightly. I looked through my catalog for something that would work here, but as a wildlife photographer, I didn't find a ton that really made a difference. So for this video, I'm not going to focus on that bokeh section, but we are going to start to get down to some of these other really interesting things called focal range and visual depth. Now the boost function down here, this slider, it simply adds a pop of light in the background if needed. In most of my images, it's not going to make a difference whether I go from 0 to 100. Again, as a wildlife photographer, my style might be a little different and my subjects might be a little different. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about bokeh, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about boost, but I do have some more goodies in here for you. So I'm going to cancel this out and get into our next example, which is this Canada goose. Now I chose this one specifically because I thought the background was okay, but I thought, how would this look more out of focus? So the pine tree has a nice texture back there, but how would it look more out of focus? So let's go into that same menu. We're going to go to camera raw. It's going to open up. I'm going to go down to lens blur and click apply. And in this example, we may have to do a little bit of work. Might not be as clean as the first one. So it's still calculating. You can see that red circle started, or that blue circle starting to fill in. And the first initial preview looks pretty positive. We look at it and we say, oh, that worked. Let me blur it out some more. It really stands out. However, and this is one of those first pitfalls, the subject isn't cleanly selected. And you'll see it here when I zoom into 100%. Notice down here, it missed an area. Now, Photoshop and Lightroom have taken care of that, but it now starts to become a more tedious and manual process. If we go down to the bottom, there's a little button called Refine. And if I open that up, you'll see two brushes, one to blur and one to add focus. So we've got our first set of controls. So the first thing I can do is select blur, and I can make my brush smaller. I'm simply going to click the right click button on my PC to do that, which is nice. And I now have to manually go here, and I have to manually blur it out. And I have to make my brush smaller and manually go in here. I can do it the opposite. So I can go to the focus, and I can put some, if I went over, I could kind of go back here. This is very similar to masking in Photoshop, by the way. But we're starting to lose the convenience. When you go in here and you have to start hitting all of these areas and blur them out manually, we've started to lose some of the convenience. So yes, it still works. It's still a powerful tool. In this one example, the subject was not cleanly selected, so I've got to go in and manually adjust that. So that's part one. I'm going to go back to fit. So I would have to clean that up. Part two on this is one of the other downfalls of lens blur. And you don't see it when zoomed out, but I promise you're going to see it real quick. Watch when I go in here. This image was originally shot at ISO 8000, so a pretty noisy image. When I blur out backgrounds, what I do is remove the noise. It essentially just blurs out the noise with it. And you end up with two very distinct noise patterns. One on the subject. So if we look down at these wings, you could see that there's noise in the wings, but there's not noise in the background. Now, it could be a problem for you, or it could be something that you can work around. It really just depends on how much noise is in the image and how much blurring you've done. I'm going to open that up, and we're going to zoom in here, and we're going to see the difference. That's the original. That's the blended, or that's the lens blur. The original and the lens blur. And you can see it dealt with some of that, but it's not always going to be perfect. So you might get a little bit of noise left in there, especially on the subject. So that's the second part of lens blur. Getting a little more complex. We started with the easy. Now we added in the ability to refine the focus areas and refine the blur areas. Let's get into the third example. And this is one of my favorite features of the lens blur. I'm going to go into my filter. I'm going to go to camera raw filter again. Again, if you're working in Lightroom, just go down to lens blur. I'm going to hit apply just like I would with every image. And we're going to look at something called I'm going to call it a depth map. In here, it's going to be, the terminology is visual depth. It's really, really neat. The great thing about lens blur is you're not, in the first couple examples, the subject was here and the background was here, two different focal planes, and it did a really nice job just blurring out this background. So the subject stayed here, background got blurred out. But what happens when it's a continuum? What happens when there's like a long branch? Well, that becomes really tough. Here's where lens blur excels. I'm going to click on this box down here that says visual depth. Don't get confused with this. I just want you to understand a few things. You're going to see a pattern of colors represented down here. They go from light to black. I want you to think of the light as the foreground and the dark or the purple as the background. So yellow kind of the foreground, purple the background, the pink area in the middle. This represents what Photoshop has determined, or Adobe has determined, to be the depth of the image. Now, this is unlike many other techniques where everything was either subject or background or subject or foreground. Now I've got a continuum, and this is really, really powerful. Photoshop has also given me the ability to control the continuum. So if you look at this little box down here, remember I said the yellow would represent the foreground, so the left side of this kind of looks like a histogram. It's not really. The right side is going to represent the background. The subject is here in the middle where that dot is. There's a couple of things we can do. I can actually click on this little target, this little point, and I can select where I want the area of focus to be. So I'll click on that and click on that. And that determines where I manually want it to be. So if Adobe has kind of done this for me, if I want to specify exactly, that's going to leave that untouched. It's not going to be blurred. It's going to consider that to be in focus, and it will start blurring out from there. So what does this little rectangle represent? That rectangle represents the areas that are in focus. Anything outside of that rectangle will be blurred. You get to control it. So if I want to blur more of one side or the other, I can do that. Watch what happens to that little pin as I slide it, that little point, it moves. Here's the key to understand this. You'll notice as I'm dragging, parts of the image turn white. Anything that's white will be left in focus. That's a big deal. Anything that's white will be left in focus. Anything that is colored, let me zoom out and show you. Anything that's in the colors will still be out of focus or will be blurred. So notice how I can track this down. The bird is still white, so I'm good. But notice the log is changing. On the right side, if I go this way, the background will actually be unblurred. I'm telling Photoshop, don't blur it. Leave that as part of the range. So in this example, I'm only blurring the foreground. In this example, I'm blurring the foreground and the background, being careful to leave that bird in focus. Now let's take off the depth and actually watch it happen. So I'm going to use those same sliders. If I pull it to the left, it should bring that foreground back into focus. And notice it did. And as I slide that in, it should start to blur it out, and notice that it does. Same thing back here. You won't see it as much because the background doesn't have a lot of pattern in it, but this would be controlling the background. Let me blur it even more, and we'll see it happen here in focus. And then as I close it down, the front of that log will start to blur. Okay. And that's how that visual depth, I call it a visual depth map, but that's how that map works. You select what's in focus and you select the areas to blur. It's extremely powerful, and it works really, really well when you've got this continuum of depth happening. Okay, so we've got that one done. We are in good shape, and we're moving on to another image. Ironically, I didn't even realize I have another American red star. Now, why did I choose this image? We've got foreground and we've got background. It's not really a continuum, but we're going to use those filters we just used before, and we're going to play around with this a little. I'm going to open Camera Raw. Feel free to do it in Lightroom if it pleases you. Looks like I've blown out some highlights here. I'll adjust that real quick in Photoshop or in Camera Raw. And I'm going to go down to the lens blur again. We're going to hit apply. It's going to calculate it. And what it's calculating now is that map, that visual depth. It's putting the subject in there. It's going to calculate the foreground and background. To exaggerate this, I'm going to blur it up to 100. So I'm going to take the blur all the way up, and we're going to look at what happened to it before and after. Okay, that's the before, the adjustments. That's the after. Doesn't look like a significant change. But remember, we've got this map down here, this focal range. Let's see what happens if we constrict this. If I pull it in, it should start blurring out foreground. And I'm going to select the target here just to make sure I got it right. Okay. And I can just continue to blur that foreground and background at 100%. And watch what happens. I'm going to take it to 0. That's 0. And that's 100%. Let's just focus on the background real quick. Let's just focus back there. 0, that's the original. 100%. Let's look at the lower right. Original, look at the flowers, become blurred out. By the way, blurring out an image tends to remove your focus. So elements that are in focus that compete with the focus of the subject are generally not ideal. So those white flowers, the bright color and in focus, that's a distraction. That'll pull your eye away from the subject. So ideally, yeah, I'd like those blurred out a little bit more if possible. And then if we look at the flowers on the left, let's just see what happens to them as we pull them up. Now, let's say we wanted to combine a couple things. Let's say those flowers on the left, it didn't blur them out quite as much as I wanted. Well, let's take a look at that refine feature. So now we're pulling it all together. We've got the blur amount, we've got the focal range. If we wanted to visualize it by color, we could do it here. And remember, the lighter colors here, I'm going to click on it. The lighter colors do not get the effect. Notice those flowers on the left. I'd like those blurred out, but Photoshop isn't giving me an option here to blur them. I can't compress that range anymore. It's done. So watch what I'm going to do on this one. I'm going to kind of combine all the techniques here and go to the blur brush, and I'm going to paint it on. Because these are so separated and out of the way, I'll just paint over them. I'm going to tell Photoshop, and you can see it happening in this visual map. I'm going to tell Photoshop, blur these out. I'm manually overriding what you want to do, and I'm telling you to blur them out. Let's go back here. I'll get rid of that depth, and let's look at how they blurred. There's the beginning, and now you see it, right? That's the original, and that's the 100%. So now I've blurred out all of those competing elements, and I've just got the bird in focus. It looks natural. The stem or that stalk that's coming up still looks natural, and everything appears really, really nice here. So I really like this as an example because it's got foreground, background elements. It's got some competing elements that were in focus, and this lens blur kind of took care of all of it. So wow, lens blur is the greatest thing ever created in Photoshop. It's flawless. It works perfectly. You've got control over it. There's nothing wrong with this. Well, not 100% true. And this is a little cute little fox here. Now watch what happens when I apply lens blur. And you're going to see a few issues with this right away. So I'm going to go to my filter menu again, camera raw. I'm going to go down to lens blur and apply it. Just like in all the other images, it's going to spin that blue wheel, and we're going to see what happens to the fur. So let's look in here as it's thinking. That's the original fur. Once it pops in, oh, that got interesting. Let's go in a little deeper. It looks like that fur is still there, and it tried, but look at the original. See all those fine hairs? Let's do it again. That's the lens blur. It just eliminated it. It had to create something. Now, in fairness, it does a decent job at it, but you'll always, always lose fine detail. So this technique does not work super with furry and fuzzy objects. It works much better with solid outlines. Little fine feathers, those are going to disappear. Little fine fur, all that fuzziness, it's going to go away. It's going to average it out. It's going to cut it off somewhere. But that really well-defined animal, if you're a wildlife photographer or if you're shooting people, that really well-defined subject is probably going to do a pretty good job of that. So a few of the things that I just really, really liked about this, it's just simple. And in some images, it is as simple as clicking one button and adjusting the slider, and that's it. And it may work perfectly, especially if those images are solid and have a really good separation between the background. I love the depth mapping, or this visual mapping of depth, where you can get a continuum and it's not just an abrupt change in blurring pattern. So it's gradual, and it's got incredible flexibility to control that area in focus. I showed you those sliders and how well they work. This can actually imitate an expensive lens. So you may have a lens that is f5.6, and you might be able to duplicate the effects of a lens that was f4. And to give you an idea of what those costs could be, the difference for a wildlife photographer from f4, let's say a 500 f4, to a 500 5.6 could be thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of dollars in some extreme examples. So the ability to get that extra bokeh is really, really appealing. Now remember, this only deals with focus and blurring areas, out of focus areas, and bokeh. It does not have anything to do with the amount of light gathered by the lens. So those more expensive lenses with those larger apertures will always come in handy when it comes to light gathering. And the last thing I like about this is you almost get to shoot at two apertures in one scene. So you get the advantages of a wider depth of field. So if you're shooting at f5.6 or f8, you'll get a wider depth of field. And then by blurring out the background, you get the benefit of the more shallow depth of field. So a little bit of the best of both worlds done through software. So I kind of like that feature, but there are some cons. One, the subject is not always going to be well defined. And when it's not, it can be really, really, really troubling because you'll lose a lot of the edge detail. Another thing about this is that while the backgrounds will lose their noise pattern, the subjects may not always match that noise pattern. Now, there's some workarounds for that. I'm going to discuss those on a Patreon video that I'm making, but just know that there are some problems when you eliminate noise completely from a background, including the conversion to JPEG and possible compression for social media. As you get really, really clean backgrounds, one of the things that can happen is those images get compressed, and then you get an effect called banding. Sometimes it looks like pixelation. I'm not going to get into that a lot today, but I do want you to know that when you smooth out a background, it sounds ideal, but there can be some problems with that in terms of banding and pixelation. Cleaning up the outlines can be tedious. One of the problems with this is if you've got a subject that's got a lot of nooks and crannies, I want you to remember that the feathers of that goose that did not get captured automatically, manually refining those can be a little bit tedious, and it kind of defeats the purpose of this really easy to use lens blur feature. We mentioned it does not work well for fuzzy areas. And I also need you to know, this is digital manipulation. So once you manipulate this object, you are no longer eligible for most photography competitions. And so you've now entered this software into the image, and it's now not eligible for contest if that's a concern for you. Now, hopefully you enjoyed this video and you got to learn a little bit more about this lens blur feature, both the good and the bad. Now, I also have some bonus material over on my Patreon site, and that material is going to cover some unique applications for lens blur, specifically around bird photography. And it's also going to talk about ways to deal with some of the issues that occur when using this application. If you're not subscribed to the channel, go ahead and hit the subscription button. There's a little bell for notifications. That'll let you know when I have a new video out. Down in the comments, let me know if you found the video helpful, if you like the content, or if there's anything else you'd be curious about and you want to see a video about that topic as well. Throw it down in the comments and I'll see what I can do. As always, I appreciate you viewing this video today, and I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.